It's that time again. Time to explore the strange world of the supernatural. And tonight, I want to tell you an unnerving tale of a short series of hauntings which happened to a friend of mine. It all began some 4 or 5 years ago when this friend moved into the area from London. He'd been redeployed by his company from the south, and this was his first time north of Watford Gap. So he didn't know what to expect. His image of the north was all clogs and shawls and back-to-back houses, so it came as a pleasant surprise when he found a lovely old house in the countryside at a price which was about a third less than he would have paid in London. The house itself was a converted barn. The main feature was the huge sitting room which extended to the ceiling far above him, and the gallery which looked down onto it from the first floor. In short, it was most people's idea of the perfect home. The original barn was over 200 years old, and the exterior was built in the Tudor style. Anyway, my friend and his family soon settled into the house and into life in the north. And like so many people, they all soon found out that the odd stories which they'd heard of northerners were completely false. In fact, they were overwhelmed by the friendliness of their neighbors. Life was good. The 2 children quickly settled into their new schools, and my friend's wife got a part-time job at the small post office in the nearby village. In short, they were very happy. Until, that is, the strange events began to occur. It was nothing much at first. One night, after they'd all gone to bed, my friend was woken up by a strange scratching noise which seemed to come from the far side of the bedroom. He lay there in the dark for a while, trying to figure out what it could be. After about 10 minutes or so, the noise stopped. My friend decided that it must be mice in the walls. I mean, this was an old building after all, so it wasn't unusual for there to be mice. He settled down to sleep again, but was woken again about an hour later by another noise, seeming to come from the walls. It was a sort of tapping noise, as if someone was going along outside testing the wall with a small hammer. This time, my friend got up and went over to the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall. And when my friend put his ear to the wall, it definitely got a bit louder. Mystified, but not unduly worried, he went back to bed and put it down to the normal nighttime movement of the house. After he'd fallen asleep, he was troubled by a terrible nightmare. He dreamt that he was being buried alive, and although he could see and hear and even feel everything that was going on around him, the people who were with him obviously believed that he was dead. He had a clear picture of being in a coffin and the lid being lowered onto it. Then after a pause, he felt the coffin being lowered, presumably into the ground, because he was suddenly startled by the sound of earth being dropped onto the lid immediately above him. It was like living out an Edgar Allan Poe horror story. Just as he felt the oxygen being used up in the confined space of the coffin, he woke up, sweating. The next morning, which was a Saturday, he told his wife about his strange nightmare. His wife convinced him that he was suffering from the strain of moving and the new responsibilities of his job, which seemed logical enough. So he decided to ease off a bit and use that weekend to have a leisurely stroll in the beautiful countryside around his front door. But that night, after he had gone to bed, he heard the strange tapping and scratching noises again. Only this time, they were joined by another noise. It was indistinct at first, but it soon became clear enough to hear properly. It was like a voice in anguish, a voice sobbing quietly but bitterly. As the man lay there listening to the voice, he started to hear words. They were mostly garbled and unintelligible, but he did hear the odd phrase. Phrases like, "God help me," "For God's sake hear me," and "No, no, no." My friend didn't know what to do. He didn't want to wake his wife in case it was just his imagination. On the other hand, he wouldn't be able to sleep with this voice ringing in his ears. He decided to get up and make himself a hot drink. But just as he was putting on his dressing gown, a slight movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned sharply, and he will never forget what he saw. Standing in the corner of the room, bathed in the moonlight coming in through the gap in the curtains, was the figure of a man. Involuntarily, my friend gave a sharp cry of fright, and in doing so, he woke his wife, who sat up in bed. She looked over to the window and saw her husband standing, staring into the corner of the room. Her eyes followed his gaze, and suddenly she screamed as she saw the figure as well. Because in the short time that it had taken her to sit up and focus her eyes, the figure had become more than just a grey blur. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat and wearing a high wing collar and cravat. Its hair was long and hung down over his collar as if it was wet. But the most awful thing about it was the face and the hands. The face was a mask of terror. The eyes were wide and staring, and the mouth was open in a silent scream. And the hands were stretched out in front of it. They were blood-soaked, and the fingers looked as if they'd been scratched and battered. The hands were turned palm upwards in a sort of pleading gesture. The couple were rooted to the spot in terror. They could neither move nor speak. All they could do was watch in horror as the figure began to slowly stagger towards them. But there was more horror to come. Because as the figure advanced towards them, it became more discernible. And when it was but a few feet from my friend, he saw that its face was his. It was like looking into a mirror. Except for the long hair and the blood dripping from the forehead, the features were exactly the same. Slowly, the figure approached my friend, and when it was only a foot's length away, it stopped. The eyes seemed to change from a look of terror to a look of infinite sorrow. It then turned to look at my friend's wife, and despite herself, she stopped being scared and felt intense pity for the poor unfortunate person. Tears began to stream down her face, and soon her body was racked by silent sobs. The ghost, for that is what it was, slowly dropped its arms and just stared at the woman. My friend swears to this day that he saw tears well up in its eyes, and then it gave a sort of half smile and slowly faded away before their eyes. The couple didn't move for what seemed like ages, and then suddenly the import of what they'd just witnessed hit them, and they both collapsed, overcome by a strange emotion. They felt drained, sad, bitter, and happy all at the same time. They didn't sleep again that night, and in the morning my friend rang me to tell me what had happened. He'd long known of my interest in the paranormal and wanted my advice. So that Sunday morning, I went over to see them. And after they'd told me their tale, I believed everything that they said. There was no reason not to. The sincerity in their voices and manner was proof enough for me. They asked me if I could do something about it, as they didn't think that they could stand another visitation like that again. So I contacted my medium friend and asked him to come over for an emergency. He did so, and as dusk began to fall, we made contact with the poor unfortunate who was bound to the house. And after we determined certain facts, we conducted a psychic rescue. For the first and only time in all the years that I have been conducting psychic investigations, just as the rescue was complete, the four of us, that's my friend and his wife, the medium, and myself, all saw the figure of the man appear before our eyes. Only this time, it looked serene and at peace. It looked at us for a long time, and we distinctly heard the words, "Thank you." And then it faded from our sight. It's never been seen again by my friend's family. I conducted my research on the psychic information the medium and I got from the session, and on the house itself. And I found out that in the early 19th century, the owner of the house, which the barn was part, had disappeared, and had only been found some 3 months later, buried under the hay which had been stored in the barn, and which had apparently fallen on him unbeknown to anyone. He was only discovered because the hay was being used as cattle fodder and had been used up over a period of months. Across the decayed body of the man was a heavy beam of wood which had obviously pinned him to the ground. His skull had been caved in across the forehead. During my searches, I found an old woodcut of the poor man. He bore an uncanny resemblance to my friend. On an impulse, I asked another friend of mine if she would do some hereditary delving into the man's family. And she found out that, by some strange quirk of fate, the man who had died all those years ago was in fact a distant cousin of my friend. Perhaps the ghost had waited all those years to be rescued by his own blood relation. Who knows?